Let's talk about critical appraisal of empirical research. There are different types of guidelines for research and separate guidelines for the conduct of research, that is, how to do it, how to conduct research of different types. These are guidelines for researchers. There are also guidelines for the reporting of results of research, more guidelines for researchers. And there are guidelines for critical appraisal, that is, how to assess reported research results, and these are aimed at readers. So we will take a quick look at the guidelines for conducting or reporting research and then focus on critical appraisal. So guidelines for research conduct. Again, they focus on how to do research, and many of them concern ethical issues, how to protect the rights of human subjects, our ethical obligations to colleagues and others. Some guidelines focus on general principles of good science, such as good practices related to data management, data security, and archiving, or good practices related to supervision, collaboration, publication, and authorship, or procedures to enhance the validity and credibility of research. And then there are guidelines for how to conduct specific types of research, so how to do an experiment or an ethnography or intensive interviewing or a longitudinal study. And the second type of guidelines for research have to do with reporting the results. So there are many tools and checklists developed to guide full and transporting of results of empirical research. These are essentially instructions to authors of books and articles that focus on what readers will need to know to understand and evaluate the research. Many of these guidelines have been adopted by journals, and authors are expected, or in some cases required, to follow them. So let me just give you some examples of what these look like. So here's an example of reporting guidelines for qualitative research published in the journal Academic Medicine. And you'll see that it's basically a synthesis of recommendations across many articles and many journals over some period of time. And on the right, you see that this is basically a checklist of things that people are expected to report related to qualitative research. The checklist remains flexible because qualitative research encompasses a number of different kinds of studies on many different topics. Another example, this is the reporting standard for randomized controlled trials called CONSORT. And here, authors are expected to complete this checklist, that is to report all of the items on the checklist on the left, and to provide a completed flow chart showing how participants moved through the study. And the last example is called PRISMA, which stands for the Primary Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. Another checklist that authors are expected to complete, and another flow chart, this time showing how records or documents related to research flow through a systematic review. And then in terms of applying the reporting guidelines, there are a number of ways in which people are asked to match their studies to the many guidelines that are out there. The Equator Network is a really wonderful organization that hosts a database that includes guidelines for reporting all kinds of studies. Here's their website, and they give us a flow chart to show researchers how to know which guidelines to use in reporting the results of their work. And that's like this. So basically it starts with the question, was the research on humans? And if no, we go to some other paths that deal with animal research. If yes, then a series of questions help us determine which reporting guidelines to use for a particular study. This is very useful because you'll notice that they're not using simple research design labels. They're just questions about the nature of this study. But you won't need to worry about this unless you're reporting the results of original research. What we do need to worry about is critical appraisal of empirical research now. So in this context, critical appraisal means thoughtful, careful, accurate, and fair assessment of a piece of research. Critical does not necessarily mean negative. So critical appraisal doesn't mean that we are criticizing or making a negative assessment. A critical appraisal can include negative statements as well as positive statements. And in this context, fair means reasonable, not necessarily evenly balanced. It's not half and half. So a critical appraisal weighs the pros and cons of a piece of research, and based on the nature of that appraisal, it could result in mostly positive, neutral, or negative conclusions. Here's some general approaches to critical appraisal. We find in the literature some general guidelines about how to read research reports. And there are guidelines for different types of research designs, so how to understand a randomized controlled trial or a cohort study. There are several principles that we'll talk about, and also another approach to critical appraisal focuses on the inferences that are made about the results of a study, and that's the approach that we're going to take. So here's some general guidance. You'll see a lot of lists like this in the literature, but I think this is good advice. So when you're reading research reports, you need to read it closely and carefully. Skim reading is not good for understanding the complexities of empirical research. And second, if you don't understand something, say so, or better yet, look it up. Third, identify and then question the author's underlying assumptions. What are they assuming about the nature of an intervention or a population or research itself? And feel free to question those assumptions and question your own premises or the assumptions that you're starting with, because they may be incorrect. Fifth, see if you can identify any logical fallacies in the work. See if you can identify any common cognitive biases. Call out bullshit when you see it. Eighth, build your numeracy skills, your ability to understand numbers, tables, and graphs. And that's something we're going to work on a lot in the rest of this semester. Ninth, form sound, well-reasoned arguments to accept or question research findings and conclusions. And finally, become comfortable with uncertainty and not knowing. We're not always going to find definitive answers to questions that we care about. In fact, definitive answers are pretty elusive. So we need to become comfortable with that. So let's talk about elements of research design that we think about in critically appraising studies. First of all, studies can be described in a lot of ways, and the research design elements can be combined in myriad ways. Some terms are used to describe the purpose of a study. So for purpose could be exploratory, descriptive, explanatory, and so on. Some terms refer to sampling or sampling plans. So we will talk later on in this semester about probability and non-probability samples. But there are other kinds of samples that are called quota or cohort and many other terms. Some studies are described as having structured, semi-structured, or unstructured measures. And studies can also be described in terms of several aspects of data collection. The mode of data collection refers to how data were collected, perhaps through interview, survey, observation. We could add online, analysis of text. And also data collection occurs in various time frames. A cross-sectional means at one point in time. Longitudinal is more than one point in time. It can be retrospective, looking back in time, or prospective, moving forward. There are also terms that are used to refer to the overall design of a study, like randomized controlled trial, or quasi-experiment, or case control, participant observation, ethnography. And then finally, some terms refer to the type of analysis that's performed. For example, some types of analysis are called content analysis, thematic analysis, regression analysis, hierarchical linear modeling, and meta-analysis, just to name a few. So when you see an article that describes a study as a descriptive probability study or an interview study with longitudinal data or a content analysis, people are picking descriptors from any aspect of the research. And for that reason, these labels are not very useful. So we really want to get beyond the common labels used to describe research because they also have multiple meanings. So for example, the term a controlled trial is applied to both randomized and non-randomized studies, and to one group before and after comparison, so pre-post comparisons. So that's very inconsistent, and by itself the term controlled trial is not very meaningful. Similarly, the term quasi-experiment covers dozens of different research designs with wide variations in the rigor and applications of those designs. Now we'll unpack those terms a little later in the semester. The third example here, observational study, could refer to a non-experimental study, a longitudinal study, participant observation, or pure observation. So again, we'll need to unpack that later on. But here, the main point of this slide and the one before it is don't rely on research design labels to tell you how a study was conducted. So our critical appraisal of empirical research will start with a type of question or hypothesis that either we or the study are asking, or we can start with the kinds of conclusions that are drawn, and then assess how well the study addresses the question or hypothesis and the validity of its conclusions. Now, most critical appraisal tools are developed for specific research designs, but again, that doesn't necessarily address the goodness of fit between research questions and methods. So we talk about validity at two different levels. At the sort of more concrete level, there is the validity of measures, which refers to a specific measurement instrument. And here we're asking about the extent to which a measurement instrument accurately captures the construct of interest. Now, we talked about this in week 3 when we talked about constructs and categories and measures. We talked about different types of validity of measures, including face validity, content validity, concurrent validity, predictive validity, etc. Okay, now we're going to talk about a broader concept, and that's the validity of an entire empirical study. It's a much bigger idea and it has many more components. We will unpack this idea a little more later on as well, but for now we'll say that in this context, in the context of an entire study, validity, meaning accuracy, truthfulness, or credibility, is not a property of research designs. So it's not that some research designs are more or less valid than others. For example, randomized controlled trials are not inherently more valid than surveys. Validity is a property of the inferences or conclusions that are drawn from a study based on logic and empirical evidence. It's a very important idea. So in terms of overall validity of a research project, there are 3 types. Construct validity is about the extent to which key constructs are accurately assessed or measured. Internal validity is the extent to which a study can rule out alternative plausible explanations for hypothesized relationships. External validity is similar in meaning to the term generalizability. It means the extent to which study findings might apply to other people, settings, and times. And then statistical conclusion validity concerns the proper use of statistical analyses, including issues of statistical power, which we'll get to in a couple weeks, which means whether studies are adequately designed to detect associations or effects of interest. So let's again go back to this idea that there are many different types of inference. And I've presented the different types of inferences in this categorical scheme, showing that we can make inferences about different kinds of research questions. And you've seen this before. This shows you the topics of inference that you just saw, along with the logic and evidentiary requirements needed to support inferences of that kind. So our critical appraisal is going to follow this schema as well. So just as an example, if I'm critically appraising a study that looks at causes and effects, I'm looking at the second to last row, and I'm going to need support for all of the things that have X's in the middle. I'm going to need support for reliable and valid measures or thick description in the qualitative realm. I'm going to need support for some kind of counting. A cause and effect relationship needs to demonstrate association, and I will need the statistical power, which we'll talk about later, to find that association. I will need evidence of time order. The cause has to come before the effect. And I will need evidence of that there's a logic, a theory of change, and that I can rule out other plausible explanations. Okay, so all of those things are required for causal inference, one of the most difficult kinds of inference to make. So let's begin at the beginning of our critical appraisal checklist, which is available to you in Moodle and will be available in an appendix to the workbook. And our guidelines for critical appraisal of empirical research start with some general questions that apply to all studies. And the first question is, what is the purpose of this study? What kinds of questions or hypotheses are the authors asking or assessing? And overall, are their conclusions supported by sound logic? Are the conclusions supported by credible evidence? Are relevant comparisons available? So if they're making comparisons, do they provide you with the data to support that? And are other explanations possible? Either explanations that they've considered or perhaps explanations that they haven't considered that occur to you. So those are some initial questions. Then we move into appraisal of constructs and categories. And again, we do this for all studies because all studies have constructs. And the questions are the main ideas, the key constructs, clearly defined? Are the key constructs grounded in theory and/or empirical observation? And then for structured or quantitative measures, we'll ask the following three questions. Is the level of measurement appropriate for the construct, which we talked about in week 3? Is there evidence of reliability of the measure? And if so, what kinds of reliability have been established? Is there evidence of validity of the measure? And if so, what kinds of validity have been established? Again, those questions go back to our material from week 3. And then for development of themes or constructs from text or observation, and now we're talking about qualitative or naturalistic research, we'll ask the next two questions. Is the process of data collection and coding clearly described? Is the development of main themes or concepts clearly described? And again, we talked about this in week 3. Then we're going to look at the study design that we're studying and ask, is the study fit for purpose? Is this study roughly designed to answer its questions or test its hypotheses? And if the answer is no, you can stop here. It's not worth going on. Then if you continue, you will ask, is the study primarily a review or a synthesis of the results of other studies? And if so, we're going to skip to a tool that's designed to assess multiple systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And in any case, we'll ask which of the remaining sections of our critical appraisal tool are relevant for your question or study. And you might need to look at some or all of these sections: qualitative research, rates and trends, associations, predictions, causal inference. And I'm just going to go through these quickly. We're really going to spend the next few weeks getting into depth about what these kinds of inferences are and what kinds of studies can support them. So for qualitative research, we're looking at assessing the rigor and trustworthiness of a study. Lincoln and Guba came up with several categories of rigor that are very useful, and these are to some extent used as alternatives to the types of validity that I mentioned before. So while validity is often used in assessing quantitative research, and I'm talking about construct validity, internal validity, external validity, and statistical conclusion validity, in qualitative research, Lincoln and Guba said we need a different set of criteria. And here are the criteria. Credibility means, are the findings believable? Or in other words, are you confident in the truth of this study? Transferability means, are the findings meaningful for other populations in other times and places? Because if this is just a one-off, this is just a case study referring to one person or town that really has no meaning outside of that, it's not going to be very useful for you, perhaps. The third criterion is dependability, which is about whether findings are consistent across perspectives. Could they be repeated? Do different people come to the same conclusions? And then confirmability. Do the findings emerge from participants and not from researchers' bias? So here's some threats to rigor and trustworthiness of qualitative research. Reactivity refers to the potentially distorting effect that a researcher can have on the observations, the phenomenon under study, or the data. And this, Lincoln and Guba suggest, can be addressed by prolonged engagement in the field, by what's called triangulation, which is using multiple data sources, and by member checks, which means going back to the people that you've talked to and making sure that your understanding of what they said to you is accurate. Another threat to the rigor and trustworthiness of qualitative research is researcher bias. And this means that the observations and interpretations are shaped by the researcher, not by the participants. This can happen when researchers ask leading questions, ignore data that doesn't fit their ideas and conclusions, and are either over or under engaged in the setting and in relationships with participants. This problem can also be addressed by triangulation and by peer debriefing, talking with other researchers after the fact about what one is seeing and concluding to see if other researchers would come to the same conclusion. Member checking, again, means going back to the people that you've talked to make sure that your understanding of what they said is accurate. Negative case analysis means looking at cases that seem contrary to the trends that one is finding in a qualitative study. And we can also check researcher bias by creating an audit trail or sort of footsteps that someone else could follow to see if the development of our ideas is biased or really true to the data. Another threat to the rigor and trustworthiness of qualitative research is respondent bias. So participants in a study can withhold information, they can lie, they can have faulty recall, and so on. And this also can be addressed by prolonged engagement, triangulation, and member checking. Okay, so if you'd like to learn more about qualitative research and these evaluative criteria and ways of establishing credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability, this is a very nice website, and the URL is at the bottom left. So let's now talk about different kinds of studies that we may be interested in. So if we're doing our critical appraisal, we've started with the general questions that we asked before about the purpose of the study. We also looked at questions about constructs and categories. And now we need to think about the kinds of studies we're looking at. So if it was qualitative studies, we've completed a section of our critical appraisal on qualitative research. If we're looking at rates and trends or any kind of quantitative study, we now need to ask some questions about the data. So here's some questions for rates and trends, and these will be needed to look at associations, predictions, and causes. Is it clear what the data points represent, what's being counted? If proportions are used, is it clear what the numerator and denominators are? If a percent change is reported, what's the base rate? We're going to talk about that in week 6. So this is just to orient us to the kinds of data that are being reported. And if it's not clear to us, that may mean it's not well reported or not well conceptualized. Then we ask, are you confident in the accuracy of the data? Do you have any reason to worry about the accuracy of the data? If graphs are used, are the scales and the axes of the scales meaningful? Are all relevant observations included, or are some observations left out? Some participants left out, perhaps. If the authors are making comparisons, are these comparisons fair? Are they based on comparable data? And is uncertainty relevant? Is it possible that we don't know how accurate some of the estimates are? And if so, are ideas of uncertainty adequately addressed? Let's turn to looking at associations. And again, this is just by way of introducing you to concepts we're going to cover later. So if we're looking at a study or a question about associations, then in addition to criteria for constructs and rates, we would ask, are associations analyzed in an appropriate way given the level of measurement of the variables of interest? So if we have dichotomous measures, have associations been analyzed appropriately? If they're continuous measures, are we using the right levels of analysis? Second, we would ask, does the study have the sensitivity or the statistical power needed to detect associations or differences if they exist? And this is really largely about sample size. Is the sample size sufficient? We would also ask, what's the effect size or the magnitude of the association, and is it meaningful? And could other variables account for this association? And if so, which variables? For predictions, we're going to add a few more questions. To predict something, we have to have time order. The predictor has to come before the other variable. So we ask, has time order been clearly established? Does the predictor occur before the criterion variable? Is reverse time order possible? And could other variables account for the relationship between the predictor and the criterion? Then we get to causal inference. And in addition to all the criteria we've talked about so far, we ask, how well does the study control for threats to internal validity? That means, how well does it rule out other plausible explanations for results? Now, we're going to talk about threats to internal validity in a few weeks, but here, very briefly, is an example of a tool called the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool that gets at some of these threats. It looks at whether a study result could be explained by selection bias, meaning that there are systematic differences between the groups at baseline that could account for differences in outcomes, or performance bias, meaning that something other than the intervention affects the groups differently. Attrition bias means that participant loss affects the group's initial comparability. Detection bias means that methods of assessment affect the group comparisons. And then reporting bias refers to the selective reporting of outcomes or results. And again, we'll ask whether the study has enough statistical power to detect meaningful effects. So don't worry too much about what these things mean right now. I want to introduce them to you now so that we can really flesh them out later. Then, for all studies, we're going to ask questions about generalizability. And these questions are, do the results hold up across multiple studies, across replications? Do you think they would? Can the study results be generalized to a larger population? Did the study use a probability sample and inferential statistics to estimate population parameters with confidence intervals? We'll explain all that later. How might a study result apply to similar groups or situations? Here we use PICOS and the principle of proximal similarity, all to be covered in week 11. And then for all studies, we will ask these questions about conclusions. Are the conclusions supported by sound logic? Are the conclusions supported by credible evidence? Are relevant comparisons available? And are other explanations possible? So that's a very quick introduction to critical appraisal. It is the rubric that we're going to be using for the rest of the semester, and I hope this gives you a helpful, quick introduction.